Good evening, everyone, and welcome back to the Spotlight session series, a part of the Behavioral Confluence in 2026. This is a behavioral science conference that's taking place from 12th to 14th February at Christ University in Bangalore. I am Saimrita, and I'll be your moderator for today's session. It is a pleasure to introduce our speaker for the second Spotlight session, Dr. Elliot Ludvig. Dr. Ludvig is a professor of psychology at the University of Warwick and has published over 90 research papers examining how humans, animals, and artificial agents learn from rewards using computational behavioral and neural approaches. And after completing his PhD at the Duke University, he has held research positions at Rutgers University, the University of Alberta, Princeton University, and the Technion. Dr. Ludwig currently serves as an associate editor at the British Journal of Psychology, is the research co-chair for the Academic Forum for the Study of Gambling, and at Warwick, he is the director of the MSc in Behavioral Economic Science, as well as the chair of the Open Research Group. And he was also one of my professors when I was doing this course last year. So thank you for being here today, sir. Over to you, Elliot.
Thank you, Sai. Thank you for the very kind introduction. And indeed, Sai was one of our best students on the course last year. So I'm very glad to be back or to be seeing her again and being able to present to you guys about my work. So what I'm going to talk to you about today is I'm going to talk to you about three things. There'll be three kind of sections to the talk that I'm going to give. The first part, I'll talk a little bit about basic risky choice and some of the biases we see in people when they make different types of risky choices. Then I'm going to move and look a little bit in real gambling behavior and see how some of the similar biases, it's not exactly the same, manifest themselves in that sort of space. And then the last part, I'm going to look at some of the ways that we've tried to mitigate gambling harm and some of the more behavioral science type interventions that have been used and how we've evaluated it and whether or not they work. So that's the plan. Before I dive into the details too far, I always like to start by thanking my collaborators because all the work that I do is done as a team. And all of the people that you see here between Marcia, Alice, Chris, Lucas, Dan, and Philip, that is the core of the team for the work that I'm presenting today. Without them, I would never have been able to do the work. Now, what I want you to do before I get started, and I'm not going to use the right currency, so I apologize for that, but you'll have to use your imaginations a little bit. I want you guys to, for a moment, to think about the situation where you are placed with a choice in front of you. So for those of you who know behavioral economics or have read any of the texts, this will be very, very familiar. These are the types of questions that populate the field, right? It's very common that you see things like this. It's done in experiments. It's written about in all the books. And what's amazing is that how well it actually works, right? And so if I ask you to think about, would you rather a guaranteed win of 20 pounds or equivalent amount in local currency versus a 50-50 chance of winning 40 pounds, right? And you ask an audience, including the audience today, but it's a virtual audience, so it's a little bit harder to poll. But what tends to happen in that situation is, and you might feel this yourself as you're thinking about which one of these you might want, when we're dealing with gains, most of the time, most people, well, let's put it this way, all the time, most people will take the guaranteed win. I've done this in many, many different audiences, in classes. I think I did this in class last year in Neuroecon. It always works, which is quite remarkable, that just how pronounced and how potent it is that everybody has this sort of sense. What's also remarkable is that if you follow this with a different question, and oh, my thing stopped working. Okay, there we go. If you follow it with a different question, now it's jumping ahead. It's going not where I want. If you follow it with a different question, and this is a question about losses, right? So now I ask the exact same question, and I just want you to think about it for a second because you'll likely experience the same sort of difference, right? So in this case, I ask you, would you rather lose 20 pounds for sure? Would you rather take the equivalent of 20 pounds out of your wallet and put it on the table and leave it behind? Or take a 50-50 chance of losing 40 pounds. In that case, right, almost everybody experiences this as they are more risk-seeking. They might not totally take the risky one. But in this case, when you do this, the majority of people will then take the gamble, right? So this raises questions about, whether there's even such a thing as risk aversion, so to speak, because these are, equivalent expected value gambles in both cases, and people behave very differently. Now, there's lots of explanations for this in the behavioral economics field, from things like loss aversion, and lots of theories are built around it. Even prospect theory, this is a core component of it. But what I want to push next is actually, and here's an example of, I adapted some data from the very, very famous Kahneman and Tversky paper that shows that in their case, the one they asked, there was about 20% of people were gains and 85% of people gambled when it was the losses. But what I want to do is I want to ask a different question. I want to ask you the question of how often does anybody ever ask you something like that? Right? That is a very, very unusual type thing that really only happens in talks, in behavioral economics experiments. Sometimes at a bank, they might ask you that if they're trying to build like a risk profile of you that they want to then use for things. It's very, very unusual. The decisions you make in life are not like that. The decisions you make in life have a lot more ambiguity. And when you're making these sorts of risky decisions, it's often based on your own experience. So whether you're playing cards, whether you're betting on the stock market, whether you're an animal trying to figure out how to get food in the environment, or even if you're doing something very, very banal, like deciding whether or not you need to pay for parking in an area or take a risk of having to perhaps accruing a ticket. And when you're doing that, in all those cases, you don't know anything. You don't really know the odds. You don't know what the outcomes are. You don't even necessarily know what the potential payoffs are, but we make those decisions all the time. Um, and so that decision space is often known as decisions from experience. And it turns out that people will actually sometimes behave very differently in decisions from experience. And so here's an experiment that we ran. We called this our doors task, and this is one example. And we've done a bunch of different experiments in this space, but I'll give one or two examples so you get the main point. And so what we do here is we have people come into the lab or do it online, and it's a very simple game. Right? And the game is presented with different colored doors, and they have to learn what's behind them. And they do that by choosing between pairs of doors. So in this case, there's four doors, red, yellow, green, blue, and the payouts behind the doors exactly correspond to what I just told you in terms of the numbers, right? Those two questions asked at the beginning, 20 versus 0, 40, or minus 20 versus 0, minus 40. It's exactly what happens in the game, except we don't tell them that in advance. Right? They don't know that the green door always gives them minus 20. They don't know what the odds are in any of these cases. They can only learn it from their own experience. So they could play this game, pick the red door, pick the yellow door, pick the green one, and then they gather up experience, and then they can choose. And we can measure their choice. How is their preference in the same way that you measure preference when you ask people between explicitly described outcomes. So we did that as an experiment, and we did this as an experiment where sometimes people were asked explicitly, like you were at the beginning, and they also had the chance to learn from experience. So what we see is like this. So here's the description version, and the description version is exactly what you would expect. It's a little bit smaller of an effect than you usually see, but it's in the right direction, where people are more risk-seeking for losses than gains, just like we saw at the beginning. But what's remarkable is that in experience, you get the opposite. So in experience, you get people who are more risk-seeking for gains and losses. So this is done within subjects. So these are the exact same people. So when you ask them explicitly what they would prefer, they tell you one thing. When you ask them which of these two options that you now have experience with do you prefer, they say something else, right? And so there's about a 20%, 25% differential across the two in terms of how people make their choices. So this is often known as a description experience gap. It's a difference between what people do when they're told something and what they do with their experience. If you look in the literature, you'll hear a lot about rare events and how people weight rare events in this context. But for purposes here, this has no rare events, right? We're just dealing with 50-50 outcomes and getting this anomalous behavior. So one of the questions that our research tries to ask is, why are these two things different? Why, when you tell somebody and they get a described outcome, do they behave differently when they get experience? And for this case, our going hypothesis is that people in experience rely a lot more on their memories, right? When you have experience, the only thing you can do is think about the times that it happened to you, remember them somehow, and use those to guide future behavior. And so what we think is going on in these sorts of experience-based cases is that people tend to remember the most extreme outcomes that happen to them. right? So when they go and they enter into this environment and they're having wins, they're having losses, the thing that stands out to them were the times that they, in this case, won 40 or lost 40. And what that does, right, is that, and why would people do that? The reason people do that is actually, it's a very sensible thing to do because extremes matter a lot. They define the frame of experience, right? That is what, right, the biggest and smallest things define what's possible, right? So it's very valuable and very useful to actually pay attention to what defines what's possible in the world. And people are obsessed with extremes, right? They're obsessed with the tallest, the fastest, the heaviest, the hardest, right? The slowest, right? Because again, that defines the edges of our experience, and it tells you, you don't have to think about things outside that, and it really creates a world that you can think in. And so these extremes were known to influence other things, perception and judgments. There's a very famous peak end rule about how effective judgments are made. But in this case, it's about how people gather up experience to make these sorts of risky choices. So how does that work here? So you have gain trials, you have loss trials. Those are the two types of things that you encounter. And that essentially lays out 5 possible outcomes. Right? This is a simplified version of this, right? With the biggest being plus 40, the smallest being minus 40. So if people remember that better, that is what stands out in their memory, makes them more risk-seeking for gains, less risk-seeking for losses, and you get the reversal of what you would ordinarily get if you just told them about it. So I make this claim, but I want to give a little bit of evidence towards that. So one of the pieces of evidence is the question of whether or not people's memories are biased. And it turns out, if you do an experiment like this, and at the end you ask them questions about what they remember, they do have a bias in exactly the way that you would expect. So one of the ways we did that is at the end of the experiment, we asked people, okay, out of all the things that happen, right, here's the copy of the door. What's the first thing to come to mind? It's like accessibility. Which of the things is most accessible to you? And in that case, people tend to, in the gain case, report plus 40. And in the loss case, they tend to report minus 40. Right? Exactly the biggest and the smallest is what they tell you when you ask that question. Not only that, if you look at how people choose on the basis of what they report, people who say plus 40 are more risk-seeking than those who say 0. Same thing on the loss case, people who say 0 are more risk-seeking than people who say minus 40. Exactly as you would expect if this memory is guiding choice. We've also done this as a frequency judgment. So at the end, we had people estimate. We showed them the door. The true outcomes were 50-50. And we asked them, right, how often did the 40 and how often did the 0 happen? People overestimate the frequency of the 40. They overestimate the frequency of the minus 40 as well. And that also correlates with their choices. So that the higher their frequency estimate in memory, it correlates with their proportion of risky choice. So the last thing I want to say about this is I say that, the extremes matter, but I just gave you one example. We've done lots of other examples across time. I'm just going to show you a second example so you can get the point. And in this case, what we did is we took the exact same experiment, but we took the numbers and we made them all 40 bigger. Okay. So now we have a case where we have a low set of outcomes, which is 20, 0, 40, right? Which is actually what was the gain before. And people were risk-seeking for that when it was just paired with a loss. But now we have a new one called the high. And the high is 60 versus 40, 80. So now the extremes are 0 and 80, right? And now what we're expecting is actually in the low, even though it's the exact same gamble we were doing before, we're expecting people to be more risk averse. And that's exactly what we see, that people are very risk-seeking in the high case, moderately risk-seeking in the high case, and very risk-averse in the low case. This is the exact same gamble. We've even done it with the same people in different contexts in the same experiment. It works. There's lots of different ways. So it really does seem to be that people are kind of forming this schema and using the edges of that schema to inform what they think is going to happen, and then making their decisions on the basis of that. So that's one type of bias. So it's the extreme outcomes, overweight in choice, they're better remembered. And it seems to create what ends the net effect is that it creates a framing effect in decisions from experience, right? That the range of possible outcomes that are experienced makes a big difference and creates these sort of relative risk-seeking or risk aversion pending on the exact range of outcomes that people have. So that's in a type of very basic risky choice. So now what I want to shift to is I want to shift to looking at this in the context of real gambling, well, closer to real gambling. And to do that, I'm going to look at 2 ways that you might give information about a gambling game. So as I said, there's a little repetition, so just that the frames matter, but I'm going to move on to this gambling game. And when you do that, when you have a gambling game, there is, at least in the UK, there actually is a regulation that if you have a gambling game, you have to tell the people what the return is. So, right? So if you have a slot machine, it has to be disclosed. It can be hidden exactly where it's disclosed. That's a different story. But there is a disclosure rule that if you have a slot machine, you have to tell people how much it pays out, right? And there's two very different ways of doing it, two frames in which you can actually do this, right? So one way, you imagine you have a slot machine, and what the slot machine does is on average, it pays out 90%, right? So that's what's known as the return to player frame, right? You're telling the player, the gambler, what percent on average will go back to them, okay? So that's one of the ways you can do it. The other way that you can do it is you can use a house edge. What does that mean? It's exactly mathematically equivalent, but you say it in the opposite direction, right? So now I say this game keeps 10% of all the money bet on average, right? So you all already there will have an intuition of which one you like better, right? Immediately, right? Which one of these you like better. So we did this was mostly done as, we did a few different things. But one of the things we did is we asked people to have just their subjective perceived chance of winning. And when we do that, on a 7-point Likert scale, it's about a 0.6, 0.7% difference between the two of them in terms of their perceived chance of winning. We've also done it in terms of how much they're willing to gamble, all sorts of other things. But I think this is very, in some ways, very convincing that already the perceived chance of winning is different. Now, unsurprisingly, this is what you see in the wild. This is a picture I took last week walking around in the city of Lincoln, which is in the east of England. I was there and for a meeting, and I was walking around, and on the street there was one of these betting shops, and this is what they had in the window. This is the ad they had out there. 97.3% payout. That sounds great, right? And sometimes people might even understand that you have a 97.3% chance of winning. But really, it means that the casino keeps 2.7% of the money every single time you roll the dice or, right, take a spin or anything like that. So in the wild, that's exactly what you see. Now, one of the things when you're trying to influence regulations with this sort of work is that, especially in this case, with gambling, the regulators and the government often perceive it also as, and there are plenty of people themselves who perceive it like this, as a thing of fun, right? And so who cares if they have a lower chance? If you're being honest, nobody's tricking you, right? And if you want to have fun, you can have fun, right? So there's a sense in which it's very difficult to say, well, people, have different perceived chances of winning or gamble more or less and use that to influence regulation because that's, in some ways the personal choice in some ways overweighs that very often from the point of view of regulation. So one other thing that we did, and this seems to have more influence in when you're trying to do that, is we asked people what it means. Just that. We just asked people what it means. And we gave them 4 choices of what it possibly could mean for each of these two situations. 90% of people will win something, game wins a prize 9 times out of 10, right? There's a few different ones. One of which is correct, which is for every £100 bet on this game, £90 on average is paid out to people, right? So this is the last one. And it turns out that maybe surprisingly, but unsurprisingly, we've done this a couple different times, but people do much better at understanding with the house edge frame. It's a lot more sensible. People don't really understand what the return to player means. They make a lot of mistakes. So it's about 20% more people get the correct response. That's a huge effect in behavioral science, right? If you could do a little thing and change behavior by 20% more people, right, now understand the risks involved in this product, right? That's a big change. And we've done this a number of times, replicated in all sorts of different samples. We've replicated in different countries, not right, mostly, well, UK, Australia, 2 countries, very similar in a lot of ways, but very far apart at least. We've also replicated it in a sample of people who are seeking help for gambling problems, so also specific subsets of people as well. And it's very robust in terms of repetition that this replicates very widely. So this house edge frame, it's better understood, leads to lower estimated chances of winning. And the gambling products themselves seem sometimes to be structured to perhaps maximize returns, right? Look how they present the data, 90, right? The 97.2. But also at the same time, what that can do is that can also maximize the harm associated with the product. And so that leads us to, well, how do you mitigate that? And that's what I'll spend the rest of the time talking about is some of the work that we've done. Well, mostly evaluating that. So one of the ways to mitigate this kind of draw towards gambling and the sorts of structural features, and there's lots of them, right? This is just one of the things that gambling companies do to get you in. There's, all sorts of things from free bets to, enhanced odds to, right, rapid play, cash out betting, right? All sorts of things that they're working on all the time, right? Losses disguised as wins. There's all sorts of things that they are very, very good at in terms of, maximizing the time on machine effectively. But one strategy that is widely used in lots of parts of the world is trying to use safer gambling messaging as a type of preventative intervention, right? Go out there and so in any jurisdiction that has not any, but a lot of jurisdictions where have these ads for different types of gambling companies, they'll often have these sorts of little safer gambling warnings, right? All sorts of different ones. People like them because they're freedom preserving interventions. It's not a ban, right? It lets people do what they want to do, right? It gives you the freedom to do what you want, but it also may persuade you, right, in particular ways, or give you more information that you might need, or point you to resources you might want to have access to. And in some ways, it's similar to some of the things that are used with tobacco and with alcohol, and it very, very widely used. One problem with those things, though, is, well, the question is, do they work, right? And so a lot of them that are rolled out are not really tested in advance, right? They're come up with in a marketing team, right, who think this is a good one, right? So this is one that ran in the UK for a really long time, a number of years. It ran until about October 2021. In fact, it was disbanded after our research. So there you go. Behavioral science can make a difference in a lot of ways. And so this one was on the bottom of a lot of that. So it was when the fun stops, stop. And so if you look at it, you might recognize that perhaps it might not be the most face valid of safer gambling messages. Because if you squint or you stand far enough away, the only thing you see is the word fun. It is the part that leaps out at you from the messaging. And so you might immediately think that it's not necessarily going to be the most effective as that. And so what we did is we tried to go out there and test it. And so what we did is we tried to do it in real gambling games. So we built platforms that allowed us to do that. And so we redeveloped a commercial roulette software so that we were able to put it on there as a messaging. We were also we built an entire football betting platform that resembled a potential gambling website. And we had people come, and the way we would do it is we would give them a little bit of money. We would endow them with some money. So they would do a little task, right? Either something like transcribing CAPTCHAs or answering some survey questions, and they'd make a few pounds that way. And then we let them go. If they chose to, they would then go onward and enter our casino environment, and could be either football betting, roulette, and it had the messaging in different formats. It's a little imperfect, and this is the entire field, including all of behavioral economics, suffers from this in the first place, is that there's no real loss here, right? They're only gambling money that they got from us. And that's true all the time, right? So whenever any type of experimental work is I actually don't really know of an instance where somebody actually had participants come to the lab with their money that they could potentially lose. And that means that maybe it comes out a little differently, but that's a limitation of this type of work. So here's what we found. And so here we had 3 different messages that we used. One condition had no messages. One condition had the big yellow message with the word fun in big lettering. And the other one had the plain black text one, which was a variation that was not as common, but did exist in the wild in the UK when this was running. And we took several different measures. This is the roulette one. And one of the measures was the people choose to gamble at all, right? They could have just said, no, I'll just take my endowment and I'll go home. Another was whether they bet everything and went down to 0. And then another was a proportion of how much they bet. The first most obvious thing is that it didn't help That's for sure. Right. The most obvious point is that on any of these measures, and we did look at some other measures in terms of average riskiness of bet and other things, nothing. Right. There was no decrease associated with having these safer gambling messages. So people just either ignored it, didn't look at it, had seen it before. It just doesn't influence their behavior. It doesn't do anything. But we actually see a little bit of a backfire effect in the proportion bet. So all the way on the top, you actually see that it's actually a little bit to the right of the none, right? They're just about not overlapping in their confidence intervals, and that's exactly what you would, and that's very bad, right? So not only did it not help, but actually putting that message there made people slightly more likely to gamble. In the football betting, again, the same thing. Gamble at all, no effect. Proportion bet, in this case, no effect. But actually, more people were willing to bet everything when they had the message than when they had nothing. And these are well-powered samples, 1,000 participants, right? And it was really clear that this messaging was, if anything, making people gamble more. And as I said, after we ran these studies and published them, this campaign was actually abandoned and replaced with another one, also not vetted, and that was the take time to think one. And so we tested that one, and that one also maybe had a very, very mild protective effect in the proportion bet. It's slightly in the right direction, though it's still within the confidence interval. But in other measures, like in betting time, it actually got a little bit worse. And so again, no sweeping, this is a really good, mechanism for preventing people from gambling. And that was the fun stop. Okay, so the last thing I want to say is we did a follow-on study where we tried to not look at these simultaneous messages, but what we tried to do is we looked at safer gambling videos, right? So another thing that the various that people do or the companies do here is they have various videos, and they are videos of safer gambling things. So one number 5 there is actually the same take time to think messaging, but is actually as a commercial. Right. Number 4 and number 6 were actually made by gambling companies, and it shows people kind of having fun and reminding each other about, hey, we have these safer gambling tools. Don't forget to set a limit before you go gamble, or something along those lines. And number 3 was like that as well. And number 2 was made by one of these a charity that is targeted with trying to reduce gambling harm, and they also made a campaign. And they were actually involved in the evaluation as well. They kind of commissioned the evaluation to see which one of these actually does anything to behavior. So this time we did it a little differently. What we did is we had people, it was app-based, and they went into our, we recruited people to go into our app. They got to watch the video, and then they had the opportunity to enter into the app. So mostly it was about the click-through rate into the gambling part of the app. And also within the app, there was a possibility to do an initial deposit. There was a possibility to set safer gambling tools. But the main thing, our main dependent measure, was that whether people went into the app in the first place. And it turns out, which maybe not be that much of a surprise to people who've built advertising campaigns, the click-through rate is very low. Not so many people go. But here are the results. So we have the control group. About 6% of people would click through to the gambling ads, okay, which is it's very low, like just over 1 in 20 people would do it. And this was a big sample, again, about 4,000 people. So we have a lot of power in terms of detecting differences. The first thing to notice is that 2 of the ones made by the gambling campaigns actually have substantial backfire effects, as in 3 times as many people click through into the gambling app after watching the videos made by these companies that are supposed to be their safer gambling videos, but are actually, in effect, encouraging gambling. The next thing to notice is the one between the 2 red ones is the take time to think. That's the one we already evaluated as a static image on the roulette wheel. Also, as a video, really didn't shift anything at all. It's the same 6%. So that's pretty consistent across completely different ways of doing it, that it just doesn't do anything. People don't care. The only thing that made a little bit of a difference was the Magnets Stigma campaign. That's the one made by and it was a pretty direct video, right? It worked pretty nicely. So I'll show the video. It's only like a 20-second commercial. And then I'll come back and conclude. So that's the Stigma campaign, and that cut by half the number of people going through. So that brought it from 6% to 3%. So that's 50% fewer people who actually ended up going into the ad after watching this thing. I don't know if it'll come with audio. Oh no. Is that in general, existing UK gambling messages are largely ineffective at reducing this gambling. And I think reflecting back on the first part of the talk, I think one of the things that we need more of is interventions that directly target biases. And not only these sorts of general safer gambling things that you really have to push. And one of the reasons is that these biases are very, very deeply ingrained and come with lots of experience, right? That people have a lot of experience in these contexts, and therefore it becomes very difficult to change. The one thing that does seem to help is that when there is a general procedure of having independent, not industry design, right, helps. And perhaps because there's a sense, I'm not sure exactly why. I don't necessarily want to speculate, but I think that does help when you have independent design and evaluation. And of course, one thing we don't know, and the talks was very much about what I do know best, which is the context in the UK, a little bit with Australia, but these are of course very, very contextually dependent. And maybe some of these ads would actually work fantastic in other areas with serious gambling issues, but we don't actually know that. So that's all I got for today. Thank you for listening.